and formally welcome you all to tonight's event. So, yes, have been really excited about this discussion for a while because it's one of those things, road closures, cycle lanes, traffic, things that seem to be not necessarily part of the mundane everyday, but certainly not the kind of issues that hit the headlines. And yet this discussion has become incredibly tense, incredibly divided, and actually very important in terms of what people really seem to want to talk about it. It really matters. So it's not just a case of something that you might complain to the council about. It's the issue of who owns our streets has become much bigger than a practical one. And so in keeping with the Academy of Ideas tradition, we decided that this was a public debate that wasn't necessarily being had in public. It was being had on social media. It was being, people were writing lots of articles about it, but there wasn't necessarily a mass public forum for it. And so that's why we decided to do that. And this is what we do. I'm now going to plug us because if you have joined our Zoom events over the last year, you'll know that throughout the pandemic, we've decided to put on public events, public lectures, discussions, book clubs, salons, all for free. And none of us have been on furlough for the last year and a bit now throughout the pandemic we've been working on. So I know a lot of people aren't in the position these days financially to help, but if you are, then my colleague Alistair will share the link to support us with anything big or small in the chat. But also, perhaps more importantly, there is an option if you follow that link to support the Academy of Ideas in a different way, which is to become an AOI associate, which means signing up to get lots of info before anyone else from us, especially with the fantastic news that the Battle of Ideas 2021 is going to be happening in the autumn of this year. Signing up to become an AOI associate gives you kind of behind the scenes exclusive access to lots of things relating to that festival. And it's also a way to keep in touch with us and show your support. So if you can, that would be really great. I'll also do one tiny little plug before we get going, which is that some of you on here may know that as well as creating online forums for discussion, we've also decided to branch out this year into publishing pamphlets. And Letters on Liberty is the Academy of Ideas modest attempt to follow in the footsteps of the radical pamphleteers that came before us. And in particular, the three that are coming out in the next few weeks, one of them by Austin Williams is going to be touching on all things related to green issues, development, environmentalism, and I bet a lot of the subject matter that we're going to talk about tonight. So Letters on Liberty, I think they're about £2 or they're 3 for a fiver, or they're also available free online. But go to our website and check them out. And they're a really good resource to have, and actually a very nice collector's item because they're designed by Jan Bowman, who's a wonderful artist. So that's my plugs over. Now to get stuck into tonight's debate. And I was really keen to make sure that this wasn't just a London-centric thing. And I know that Bath isn't exactly hugely diverse from London, but I was sort of half pleased to read the news that they are now, I think it was on Monday, bringing in the first measures of their clean air zones, which means that this discussion about changing neighbourhoods, politics changing to fit a climate-friendly agenda or climate-friendly policies being brought in is certainly not something that's just happening in the remit of the ULEZ in London, where I'm living. But there are also suggestions of rolling this out in all parts of the country. And I really want tonight for this debate to not be hemmed into anyone's locality, though obviously I really want to hear what people's experiences are from their own streets, but to ask bigger questions about, asking these funny things that some people have already raised on Twitter about this debate, causing problems about the fact that some of our speakers are anti-LTN or pro-LTN. The issue here is, in the abstract, asking the question of who owns our streets. Never mind if you think you've got a problem with cycle lanes, but you do like LTNs. It's the question of, well, who gets to decide who makes these changes in our neighbourhoods? Is there proper consultation? What's the role of democracy in all of this? And there's been some fantastic research done into this, really interesting, about whether or not this is decisions about low traffic neighbourhoods or ULEZs are made on the basis of income, or made on the basis of what benefits particular people in those streets. All of those questions, and as the slogan for the Battle of Ideas and the Academy of Ideas is, free speech allowed. So we really want to hear from you. But first, we will hear from our fantastic panel, who I will briefly introduce in the order that they'll speak. So first, we have Rita Krishna, who was a Labour councillor and the cabinet member for Children's Services for 9 years in Hackney. And her street became part of a controlled parking zone, which was close to through traffic. And she wrote to me that she felt very privileged to live in what would now be called a low traffic neighbourhood. And her main mode of transport is the bicycle. And Rita's got very interesting views, as I said, in relation to having problems with some things like cycle lanes and having quite a nuanced position when it comes to the ways in which we implement green initiatives in neighbourhoods. So welcome, Rita. Thank you for being with us. Next up, we have Daniel Moylan, Lord Moylan. Lord Moylan is a Conservative peer, and he has been involved in London and national politics since the early 1990s, at various times being a councillor in Kensington and Chelsea, an officer of London Councils, a co-founder and co-chairman of Urban Design London, which is a non-profit making association of planning, design and transport professionals. He was also deputy chairman of Transport for London under Boris Johnson, as well as an advisor to the mayor on various transport projects between 2008 and 2016. And he's been involved in Crossrail and various other projects. I mean, in terms of, it's needless to say that he knows a thing or two about transport. So welcome, Daniel, and thank you very much for being with us. Next up, we have Rebekah Kelly, who is a special educational needs coordinator and an early years practitioner. Most importantly for this panel, she's the organizer of We Are Islington, which is a campaign group that primarily has begun on kind of Facebook and social media, but that has organized online and offline to discuss and campaign around what they see as the problems that residents have raised about low traffic neighborhoods. She's told me that she doesn't own a car, she doesn't drive, but that she's keen to state this isn't necessarily about cars, it's about a wider question of how decisions are made in neighborhoods and whether or not they are made with proper consultation for residents. So welcome, Rebekah. Next up, we have Emma Richman, who is currently the Executive Director of Operations at Peaks and Plains Housing Trust. She's a qualified architect and a building surveyor, and she is currently a trustee on the committee of the Pankhurst Centre in Manchester. And she's worked in social housing for over 25 years and is very passionate about communities. And Emma is also a keen cyclist and comes to that from that particular point of view. In fact, I actually think most of our panel are keen cyclists. So we're definitely well represented on that front. And then last but not least, we have Niall Crowley, who I saw cycling in Victoria Park the other day. He is a designer, writer, and former East End pub landlord who was at the front line of Hackney's gentrification when in 2002 he opened the Eclipse, a fashionable bar that brought cocktails and cappuccinos to the once infamous Murder Mile. He also used to sing second tenor in the amateur chorus of both Birmingham and Midland opera companies and self-identifies as a Northern Soul-loving West Brom fan. But most importantly for tonight's debate, all of that though interesting as it is, he is the prospective councillor for Hoxton East and Shoreditch and an organiser of horrendous Hackney road closures. So Niall is running for a vote and is, as well as We Are Islington, horrendous Hackney road closures, are a campaign group mainly based online, but also who have done a couple of offline protests throughout the pandemic involving cabbages, which maybe he'll talk about, against low traffic neighbourhoods. So that's our panel. Welcome to all of them. And what we're going to do is to give them about 3 to 5 minutes each to speak. And I'll be quite tight with those timings. And then we're going to come straight out to you guys to see what you think. So Rita, I'm starting with you, if that's all right. And just a note to everyone that I like to keep a rather authoritarian control over the mute button on these things because I live in fear of Zoom bombings. So I'm going to unmute all of you at any point. So Rita, over to you for your opening thoughts.
Thank you very much for that introduction, Ella, and thanks to the Academy for inviting me to be part of this panel. I'm really pleased to be here. Notwithstanding your introduction, though, I should say that I am focusing essentially rather narrowly to begin with anyway, and I'd like you to give me 5 minutes if you possibly could. Okay. So I'm speaking from the perspective of London and as a former councillor of a borough that pre-pandemic had some of the highest cycling rates in London by a very long way, and we achieved it without tracks or cycle lanes, but by a basket of other measures, some of which I may get a chance to speak about, I suppose, later on. But in my initial 5 minutes, what I wanted to touch on was 3 things. And as I say, in spite of Ella's injunction, I'm going to say that I'm in favour of low traffic neighbourhoods. I see them as an adjunct to other measures to manage streets. Just one tool among many measures, and the streets do need to be managed. I think that's one of my key points. And ideally seeking a better balance between the various modes of transport. Low traffic neighbourhoods are not a new idea. We have 5 in Hackney, which predate any schemes in Waltham Forest, which tends to be the sort of poster child of LTNs. Our LTNs, which are area-wide schemes, include several filters, and they contribute to the 130 or so filters which we already have in Hackney. Filters, typically bollards, but also recently planters, which close roads to through traffic, but improve conditions for walking and cycling. Prior to the pandemic, however, these areas have typically been defined and measures put in incrementally and never in the number or at the pace at which we have seen them put in recently. I think most people who live in low traffic neighbourhoods will say, and I certainly say, that reducing the numbers of passing motor vehicles improves your quality of life. There's less noise pollution, and the roads undoubtedly are and feel safer. But whatever the associated rhetoric, there can be little doubt that the rapid implementation of these schemes has diverted vehicles onto the main roads. But that said, I believe that rather than trying to remove the LTNs, the aim should be to achieve some of the similar benefits for people who may live on main roads. And this brings me to my second point, that there are too many cars in London. Although the pandemic has seen a drop in population in inner London, the population of London is trending upwards, and I believe we should and we could reduce the cars in London. So recent studies do suggest that young people are less enamoured of private motor vehicles than preceding generations, and that is cause for hope. In terms of reducing cars, we also have evidence from the introduction of the congestion charge a while ago, which was very effective initially at reducing cars coming into central London. And incidentally, the congestion charge also saw a really big uptick in numbers of people cycling. So I do advocate measures to reduce cars, particularly private cars in London. Not all cars. In fact, I propose increasing the numbers of car club cars. Car clubs are a shared resource and represent an excellent compromise, given that there are times when you might need a car. But there simply are more private cars in London than is fair. Fewer cars, better quality of life, including on the main roads. My third point actually concerns community campaigning, and we have what are clearly some excellent campaigners on the panel tonight. Were it not for community campaigns, the M11 Link Road would have come all the way into Hackney, funneling traffic through Hackney from the M11 to the rest of London and reducing our quality of life. But my question would be, are LTNs the best target for community campaigns? Cycle lanes have been put in across London, reducing network capacity and often replacing bus lanes, forcing buses into the general traffic. Being in general traffic not only makes journey times for bus users longer, but makes buses less reliable, which in turn deters people from using them. Buses in general traffic speaks to my too many cars point, but in addition, bus stop bypasses, which are part of the paraphernalia of infrastructure introduced that have been brought in with cycle lanes, and they mean that bus passengers are made to wait on the often very narrow strip of remaining bus stop. When they descend, bus users are at risk from oncoming bicycles, and blind people in particular find bus stop bypasses immensely difficult. And all for what? There's been a negligible increase in the numbers of people cycling, broadly tracking population growth in London, while making other modes less attractive, particularly the bus. So to conclude, Ella, yes to LTNs. They are in as a trial in many boroughs, but I experience the benefits myself and would like to extend these to more people. We need to reduce the number of cars to secure some similar quality of life benefits for people on main roads. And we need lots of community campaigning. But personally, I would advocate a different target. So Thank you. Those are my 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Rita. That was a really great start. Particularly, I mean, the line that our streets need to be managed is key to this debate. I mean, and the question is who manages them. So thank you very much for beginning us with those thoughts. Right, Daniel, over to you for your opening thoughts when you're ready.
Okay, hi. I've got lots of controversial things to say, but I'm going to start by being really, really boring and trying to give an answer to the question, who owns the streets? Legally, who actually owns the streets? Because a lot of people don't really understand the relationship that exists between local authorities and communities and the streets in legal terms. It's easy to think that the local highways authority, which is normally your local council or in some places a county council, owns the streets. They don't. In most cases, if you think about the street with a row of houses down both sides of it, it's actually the frontagers who own the street up to the centre line drawn between their houses. What the council does is under an act of parliament is that they adopt the streets. When they adopt the streets, a number of things happen. First of all, it becomes public highway, public highway. That means the public have the right to go to and fro, and normally that includes in their cars. The council also, the local highways authority also takes on responsibility for the maintenance of the streets and normally for street lighting. If it has street lighting, they will do the street lighting as well. So they've got all sorts of wide-ranging powers in statute over the streets, but they are not the powers of ownership. I mean, if the council really owned the street, it could apply, let's say there was a part of the street which it didn't need for traffic. It could apply for planning permission to build houses on it, like any other landowner. But councils can't do that. What the council does own was decided in a very famous but very obscure judgment by Lord Denning several decades ago, when he declared that the local highways authority only owned the top 2 spits of the highway. Now, nobody actually knows what the top 2 spits are. Spits is an archaic term for spades, but most people take it to mean the tarmac and the paving stones and the base of the road. The council owns those, and it could take them away if it wanted. But below that, the local highways authority has no ownership rights, unless, of course, it is itself a frontager or the road has been laid on land actually owned by the council. Now, is this adoption permanent? No. The frontagers can ask the local highways authorities to de-adopt the road. This is called stopping up. There's a statutory process for doing this. Most councils say no if you ask them. But if they agree, what happens is that the street reverts to private ownership. The frontagers have the maintenance and the lighting responsibility. And of course, it ceases to be public highway, so you can put a gate at the end of it if you want. Now, the reason I bring this up is I think there are a couple of moral lessons in this. The first is that something which is maintained at public expense for public benefit is genuinely and should genuinely be accessible to the public. It shouldn't be something which frontagers can somehow privatize and still have the taxpayer pay for its maintenance. As I say, if the frontagers do want to privatize it, they can ask for it to be stopped up, and then they will privately own it and nobody else can interfere with them. That's absolutely fine. But if they're going to have all the benefits of having effectively a private road, but still have it on the taxpayer, there's an unfairness, there's an inequity about that. The second thing is, it's worth remembering this because we often think that we're powerless in the face of local highways authorities, that they can just tell us. But in fact, always remember, we have got rights as well over that highway. It's not their ownership, it's ours. And we should insist on having a say. Now, that's why, and I think nearly everybody in this conversation is going to agree with this point, certainly everybody with local government experience, that's why, at the very least, consultation is so crucial to any form of change that you're going to make in the highway, frankly. And it's normally required by law, and the government was very foolish in dispensing with the need for that consultation as it drove these schemes through last year, rather cynically exploiting the pandemic, which is really what in effect was happening. And so there was no consultation. And the reason for that is that the people involved in doing it have no experience of local government. I know who they are, and I know exactly what their experience is. And they've never, ever actually had to deal with real people face to face, talking about the sorts of issues that local councillors have to talk about, which are both quite nitty gritty and boring on the one hand, but sometimes intensely sensitive and personal to people in their own lives on the other.
Last minute, Daniel.
If they'd had, I'm nearly there, if they'd had that experience, they would have known the crucial importance of detailed local consultation. There are other things I'd like to talk about. I think what Rita said was absolutely very, very interesting. I had my own solution to the sort of approach she wanted, which was a more libertarian approach towards shared space, which meant actually not managing the streets at all, because I don't actually agree that they need to be managed, and maybe we'll come to that in questions. And I also want to say something about safety, because I think the absence of cars very often reduces safety because it reduces overlooking, it reduces the sense of safety on the street. But anyway, very happy to deal with other points that come up in questions. Thanks, Ella.
That's brilliant. Thanks very much, Daniel. Some great opening thoughts there. Okay, we'll head straight over to Rebekah now. Rebekah Kelly from We Are Islington for your opening thoughts.
Hello, thanks for having me. Thanks for hosting. I joined this anti-LTN campaign in July last year when the council thrust a leaflet through my door notifying me of the people-friendly street scheme being implemented in my neighbourhood in the next 2 weeks. Now, I'm not a driver, I'm a keen cyclist, and I walk everywhere. And I was just gobsmacked that this was the first I was hearing about it. And I was not given any right to reply. I was given a farce of an engagement tool called the Commonplace app, where anybody from anywhere in the country and beyond was able to register their views on what was happening in my community. As I spent a few months of the year locked down in my home, the early part of last year, the neighbourhood had united during this time, offering assistance to one another and clapping them for carers on our doorsteps. I began talking to my neighbours about and the wider community about what was happening. And my initial shock turned into anger and outrage as I listened to those that welcomed the new scheme and those that would be disproportionately affected. A united community was now divided with bollards, pitting young against old, fit against healthy, young against old, fit against healthy and disabled and vulnerable, and the working from home trendies against working class families. I wondered how the council could get away with making major changes without any consultation, and if they can do this, what would be next? I began campaigning against the selfish ideologies that the council would be imposing on us. I attended a protest outside Islington Town Hall last July, followed by 9 other protests on the streets of Islington, and the council did not give a damn. They didn't care about any concerns of safety. They didn't care about the effects on small businesses or self-employed. They didn't care about countless testimonials from disabled or elderly people, or how services to residents may be affected. I learned that our Labour-led council that plead poverty and blame central government for austerity have spent £1.5 million on these schemes, and they've received less than 300,000 from central government, and have also pledged another 6 million from the 21 to 22 budget on a trial. It's an experiment, an experimental traffic scheme that must have a full evaluation of data and a full public consultation at the end of the trial. I've challenged the council on how this data can be accurate, because there's no evidence of an air quality monitoring before lockdown, and we are yet to see the effects on our roads until we emerge from normal life after the pandemic. Car counting devices have only been laid in my LTN during full lockdown periods, so it feels like the data is skewed to suit the council's agenda. Our public consultation is likely to be online, and it excludes the digitally enabled or those in BME communities that require communication in other languages. And consultation will again be open to anybody that wishes to support or reject these schemes, leaving it open to be hijacked by militant cycle lobbies, as they did on the Commonplace app. That's run by strands with loaded questions, and it leaves it very difficult for users to leave negative feedback. LTNs have had a profound effect on my borough, now hung in a noose of pollution with gridlocked main roads and ghost neighbourhoods. Council have created cells, which in the definition is to incarcerate people, to take away people's right of choice and disregard those without any choice, while the council dictates to residents, taxpayers, what is or is not an essential journey. It's not their place to say. Thanks, Ella.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Rebecca, for that. That's great. Okay, we'll head straight over to Emma Richman now for your opening thoughts.
Good evening, everybody. I'm a very proud Mancunian, so I'm going to give you a little bit of what's going on in my area of the country and then my thoughts. So I've worked with communities as part of my job for over 25 years. And in Greater Manchester, LTNs were developed in the 1990s, and I was involved in actually creating some of them that are going really well now in the south of the city, and we called them home zones. But GM now has got a focus on this again, and they're looking at a scheme in conjunction with Transport for Greater Manchester at 10 low traffic neighbourhoods. And this is linked to an active neighbourhoods project prioritising movement and health and safety of people over cars. The key, as a few of the other speakers have said, is timely community engagement. Part of the plan is also called the B Project, and it's looking at a 10-year plan to improve cycling networks. And Chris Boardman is the Cycling and Walking Commissioner for Greater Manchester. And he says, over the last decade, traffic journeys on residential streets has risen by 45%. 5 million more miles every year are being driven by people's front doors, and that's not on. This whole approach is championed by Greater Manchester's Mayor, and his fund supports the project. So people who tend to live in these TLNs are generally have better air quality, as been said, and are able to embrace positive life choices. This enables people to be more active and boost physical and mental resilience. But I think the solution is lots of different things. I think that the community having proper support and proper consultation. I think better public transport options. London has Crossrail, we have Northern Fail. We also need better public transports that's frequent and affordable. The government announced this week £3 billion to support a new transport fund. Will Greater Manchester see any of that? But also, cycling is great. And I think the wider thing with cycling is we need support from employers. We need support from making it easy and more accessible for people. Not everybody's a great, amazing cyclist. And what really helped me was having an employer that had really good changing facilities, and Transport for Greater Manchester really helped the route that you were going to do. And I think that we should be encouraging walking school buses and making them mandatory. But we are at the moment decarbonising our homes, and we've got strict targets to do that. And also the rise of electric vehicles. So for me, TLNs are inevitable, and we need to embrace the change.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Emma. That was really interesting. And threw out some really interesting things there, like what you would make mandatory and what needs consultation. So it's excellent for the audience to get their teeth into. Right, last but not least, we have Niall Crowley.
Hello, everyone.
Hi, Niall.
Okay, should we take advantage of the benefits of lower activity in cities and learn a lesson about what life could be like without cars? So that's the introductory text of tonight's discussion, and I thought I'd start there. It's a good question, and how great it would be if we, the public, had ever been asked or engaged in a serious dialogue about what kind of cities we want, but we never were. LTNs, roadblocks and cameras were dropped on us from a great height, as Mary Wakefield said in The Spectator recently. In late summer, with very little notice or consultation, a number of London councils simply closed residential streets across the city. I had no idea they could move so fast, she says. Some drivers still don't know what these things, these modal filters, road closures are, and drive on through, earning themselves an instant £130 fine, which is great for councils like Hackney, which has made around £1 million out of LTN cameras since the summer. What kind of city do we want after lockdown? One of the few benefits that we saw under lockdown is how ordinary people pulled together organised independent support networks to help elderly or medically vulnerable neighbours. What the imposition of LTNs and road closures does is the opposite of this, because they threaten to force many elderly and disabled residents into permanent isolation. And far from tapping into the community spirit and resourcefulness of residents, the whole policy is built on distrust of the citizen and is designed to disempower them. We are cast as irresponsible rat runners, too lazy to walk or get on a bike. We're not to be trusted with the decisions as to whether our journeys are necessary or unnecessary. Our betters will decide that for us. The policy implementation and the reality of LTNs is one of division and is acting against the potential for genuine community solidarity and cohesion. Older and long-term residents find themselves looking on as the neighbourhoods they grew up in are being completely reshaped, not for them, but for younger, more affluent and healthy citizens. I'm certain that many of the newer and younger residents don't want that any more than the older ones do. But this stuff and the way it's being done is just driving people apart. Just look at the destructive wedge being driven between cyclists and motorists. Forget cycle lanes. What's really made cycling in London so much better and safer over the last 20 years is drivers. Most London drivers are so much more aware and conscious of cyclists today. Yet in demonising motorists and doing it in the name of cyclists, we're putting all that we've learned, all that we've achieved at risk. What kind of city do we want after lockdown? You can't impose community with policies and parklets. Strong communities are about people having a sense of purpose and control. The best and most vibrant communities are so often noisy, messy, chaotic. Cars are neither here nor there in that. I was reminded of this a couple of weeks ago on a trip to Stamford Hill, home to one of Hackney's oldest and most famously close-knit communities. There's a very tangible sense of community life in the streets of Stamford Hill, more than anywhere else I can think of in Hackney. The streets belong to the people, but it's full of cars and not a little bit crazy and chaotic. But that makes no difference because people make communities, and sometimes in the strangest of places. A city is nothing without commercial life, and without citizens who have the freedom to choose how they do things, how they get around and organise their lives. Freedom of choice is not a license for selfishness, but it does mean we need to be able to negotiate how we get along with one another and to be prepared to tolerate things we don't necessarily like or agree with. That's what life in a city is. And I think LTNs are driven by an intolerance of others. Finally, to sum up, we need to think less about active travel, which I think is code for telling people what's good for them and restricting their choices, and more about how we encourage active citizens who participate and play a meaningful role in the decision-making of how our towns and cities are run. I think that's the key for building a healthy local democracy and vibrant community. Thanks.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Niall, and thanks to all the speakers for those opening thoughts. I'm going to come out to the audience now for questions. So if you'd please like to start raising your hands using the raise hand function, and we'll come out to you. I mean, there are so many things that have been thrown out by our speakers, but there are also things that we haven't addressed. So for example, someone in the chat has raised the question of air pollution, which always I find a very difficult one to debate, because obviously it's a bit like I think what Niall has just sort of touched on. I think when you live in a city, you kind of make you weigh things up and you make a bit of a sacrifice, because yes, London is certainly in places particularly dirty and busy, but I mean, that's why I love it in part, and that's why I you know, choose to live here. But also the, you know, the question of what you lose when you put in precautionary measures, but also what you lose when you don't put in precautionary measures. So the kind of weighing up game of the environment and climate change and all the kind of green initiatives on the one hand, and then perhaps you could say the authenticity of a city, as well as what some of the speakers have raised in terms of residents' ability to actually get around and get on. The only rules in this debate is that you are polite and civil, but otherwise there's our slogan is free speech allowed. So please feel free to ask a question or just make a comment. You don't have to phrase your contributions in terms of a question. Feel free to challenge our speakers and politely tell them that they're absolutely full of it if you think that, or agree with them. So I'm going to actually first come to Conrad, who is having some trouble raising his hand. But Conrad, I think I've unmuted you. Go ahead.
Thank you very much. I live in an LTN in Ealing. I live in one of 5 LTNs in Ealing, and somebody said on the chat that LTNs do not block roads, all addresses are accessible. Yes, but I used to be able to use both ends of my street to get to my home. Also, Rita said that it's not fair that some people have cars and some don't. And someone also said you could use that argument about Waitrose. You could buy, some can afford to buy food there, some can't. But that is by the by. Living on an LTN is not right. It doesn't feel right. It doesn't feel safe. However, many walkers and cyclists say it is safe. It is now 7:38 and it's dark. I wouldn't like to go out on my road at the moment because there is much more chance of me being attacked by somebody. I'm not making this up. Somebody was attacked 2 nights ago on the road above me in my LTN.
Okay.
The
last point, you got to keep it brief, Conrad. So just
yep. Okay. And pollution-wise, LTNs don't stop pollution. They stop pollution in one part of a borough and push all of that pollution onto the main roads, where people still live, and usually less fortunate people or less affable people live on main roads, and it's not fair on them at all.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much. Just see how tight I'm being with time, because I know that we have a lot of people wanting to speak in the audience and I want to give everyone a chance. So I'm going to both be authoritarian with the unmute button and the timings. So let's go next to Helen. And just FYI speakers, I'm going to take about 5 or 6 people from the audience, something like that. And then I might come back to 2 or 3 of you and then we'll rotate. So just make notes and you can come back on whatever you like. So Helen Power next.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I'm based in Manchester, and I'm actually based right now where I'm sitting right now is in an LTN. So thank you very much to the panel and for the Academy for convening this debate, which is much more even-handed, I think, than many of the debates that I've seen online. And online, the discussion's been very polarised. My reading for at least one of the reasons why that debate's been so polarised is because I think this debate exists at an intersection of 2 of the most important things that we as people who live in urban places are wrestling right now, which is climate justice and social justice. And what I think has been missed in this debate and in the process of introducing LTNs in most cases, and that's even in those places where some form of consultation has been done, is the opportunity for us as communities to wrestle with the important issues that affect LTNs, those issues of gentrification, climate justice. All of those things are things that are vital to all of our communities, and we need to be able to collectively design solutions as opposed to having solutions imposed upon us. So I'd be really interested to hear from the panel if anybody had any ideas about how that could be done more effectively, either in the future or perhaps on those schemes that have already been introduced, whether there are processes that they would recommend that could be done to make that thought process a bit more deeper for us all.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Helen. That's great. Jodie, let's come to you next. I think, Jodie, you're from We Are Islington as well, so floor's yours.
Hello, thank you for hosting this. It's been great, and thank you to all the speakers as well. So yes, I am part of the We Are Islington group, and I've been working alongside Rebekah and Niall, been one of the lead campaigners against this, the LTNs that have been imposed upon the people of London. I'm going to be quite brief with it, and the point is that, as Rebekah said, we was all clapping for carers before, during lockdown, it was all great. Then all of a sudden, it was like a major upheaval, and roads were closed to not just residents, but to emergency services and every other kind of community facilities that need to use roads, district nurses, Meals on Wheels, the bin lorries, fire engines, ambulances, police, etc. It has pushed traffic out. We have had problems in Islington where a road has been dug up for emergency roadworks. That's fine because of the gas leak, but because of the LTNs in some of the areas where this roadworks were happening, there was nowhere for the traffic to divert to, which caused immense tailbacks, which affects bus journey times, people trying to get to work, you name it, school bus trips, people who go to luncheon clubs, elderly people who go to luncheon clubs, they need to be picked up by a minibus. And we have evidence that people have been told, sorry, you can't come because we can't get to you. It is a money-making scheme that has been imposed by councils under the guise of social distancing and COVID regulations and without consultation. And I, for a fact, know that when the Highbury LTN in Islington went live, there was cars driving down a normal road, which has got many odd restrictions on it, like give way to what other vehicles, etc. And then there was a junction, which as a driver, you'd be looking for any cars coming, not see the signs, over you go, £130 fine. I was there for about an hour. We worked it out. We saved about, well, we prevented the council receiving £15,000 worth of penalty charge notices, to the extent that the council sent their own traffic wardens to this LTN in Highbury to advise drivers not to go through these restrictions, which is the only place it's ever happened in Islington, and it to the extent that it got into the national press. So there is an underlying current, and the main thing is the lack of consultation. If you ask people, half the people in this group, we might not be having this talk now. But when you don't ask people, I'm afraid you stir up people's anger, and the councils need to remember who is their boss. It is the voters. It is the people of the borough. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jodie. That's great, and very interesting question raised about the sort of the financial side of all of this. Right, okay, we'll go to Shirley Laws next.
Thank you. Okay, this question, who owns the streets? Well, I don't think anybody here, whichever side, if you want the discussion that you would come down on, I don't think anyone would disagree. There is a growing antipathy towards cars, and lots of very anti-car attitudes that we've had expressed here and elsewhere. But I think what has happened, the measures that have been taken in various ways, LTNs and so on, has actually led to who owns the streets, a real blurring of confusion, a blurring of distinctions and confusion about who owns the streets. Because when you think about some of the things, for example, I mean, just a few examples, if you were in, and these are London examples, but I think some of them certainly apply elsewhere. If you go in the area around South Kensington, for example, both cars and pedestrians are allowed around that area down from Exhibition Road, which I think makes it much more dangerous. And I think a lot of other measures make the local communities more dangerous, whether it's creating play streets for 2 afternoons a week or, over the weekend. That I think then makes it quite difficult for little children to understand whether a road is a road or a pavement's a pavement, and understanding the distinctions. I think also the fact, for example, cyclists, I mean, I live near Regent's Canal, that is supposed to be a pedestrian place where cycling is tolerated, but now it's a cyclist superhighway, really. play streets, I've said, you know, I think there are other areas where, and even in busy streets, I've noticed pedestrians now sort of expect cars to slow down to just let them go across the road, rather than the idea that, you know, roads are for cars and pedestrians go on the pavement. And a sort of an expression of really, you know, priority for pedestrians, whether and cars literally taking the back seat. So I think there's lots of things going on that are creating confusion rather than actually helping a situation of making things, you know, work a little bit more smoothly and less dangerously, actually.
Brilliant, thanks Shirley. And that's a great point for people to think about in relation to the differentiation between, you know, roads being for cars and pavements being for pedestrians, although I say that as a horrendous jaywalker, so it's a bit of hypocrisy there. Okay, I'm going to take Mohammad and then we're going to come back to the panel. So Mohammad.
Hi, thanks for organising this and thanks to the speakers. Just touching on what everyone said so far. I got involved, fun enough, well, not with LTNs, but similar things with road closures 5 years ago. I come from a tenants and residents association background. And what I found is that these schemes, a lot of them are just recycled, repackaged ideas that were, you know, rubbished by residents a long time ago, at least in where I'm from in Tower Hamlets. We have one called the Livable Street Scheme. Tower Hamlets is the most deprived borough, apparently. They've got 400 million in reserves, but they don't tell you that. But they are rolling out these schemes, and the people who designed them, the people who are the champions of these, they are not representative of the borough. I found that in whether you go to Islington or Hackney, it seems to be from one school of thought and one particular demographic of privileged individuals, whether they recognize their own privilege or not. Their parents might have been working class, but they most definitely are not. They don't recognize other people's realities. They see car bad, bike good, and that's it, it's black and white. LTNs, I'm sorry to say, in their current form are the brainchild of utopianist, insular, privileged individuals who I found really in the last year to be very distasteful people. You know, when push comes to shove, they are venomous. I found many of them, the way they've, I know social media isn't a good place to rely on because people can rely on things like anonymity and things like that, but just vicious. We've seen closet racists come out of the closets, all kinds of things. I think what we really have to recognize is a lot of these councils, the way they've treated their communities, the people in their boroughs, the people, they've ignored people's realities, and the people that are pushing this are from a limited background, some of them not from those communities to begin with. But I think we have to talk about the fact that this is imposed gentrification in many parts of the capital, in inner city areas like Islington, Hackney, Tower Hamlets. It's imposed gentrification for social cleansing. Okay. That's what it does to working class communities. That's all I'm going to say on that.
Thank you very much. Thanks very much, Ro. Right, Rita, we're gonna, and I think I might know who the councillor you're talking about potentially, but who we actually invited to be on this panel, but we didn't hear back from. Okay, Rita, I'm going to come to you first. And speakers, really, I'm just giving you a minute or two to pick up on something. Someone's noticed in the chat that not many of our audience members ask questions. I have no problem with that. I think it's you pick up on some of the things that you've heard, particularly Rita. We've just heard Mo describe people who are pro-LTN as you know, out of touch, elitist. I wonder what you have to say about that, but anything else that you want to pick up on just for a few minutes?
Yes, thanks, Ella. And I have to say that I was looking forward to contributions from the audience. I understood that the debate would be not necessarily all questions to the panel, but actually we would have a chance to really listen to what people are saying, you know, in the spirit of consultation, for want of a better word, actually. You know, you do want to actually listen and hear what people have to say. But the few things that I do want to pick up on are, there was, I think it was Daniel actually, so it wasn't the audience, was talking about not needing to manage streets. And I so disagree with that actually that's the first thing I want to remark on, actually, because the management of streets, you know, whether it is sweeping them, or keeping the footways clear of clutter, or putting in measures, and I wrote this to you actually, Ella, that it was, you know, prior to living in a CPZ, I could hardly get across my street. Whereas when there was a controlled parking zone introduced, so this was prior to the LTN, just the fact of having yellow lines painted around the corner and areas that people couldn't park on meant that I, as a pedestrian, was able to wheel my suitcase safely across the street. The streets absolutely need to be managed for the benefit, not just of the car drivers, but actually for, you know, for the benefit of everyone. So managing streets, that was one thing I wanted to comment on. There's been quite a lot said about whether they are safer or not by different people. And I suggest perhaps to the gentleman in Ealing that he, you know, in our case in Hackney, the streets have felt ever so much safer since we focused on street lighting. So I think well-lit streets are actually absolutely key to making people feel safer. The other thing was this issue about whether it's exclusionary and whether it's rich or poor. And actually, although I don't usually quote the kind of research that there is out there because I don't really have a lot of time for it. Much of it is not very good, but there was a recent study that's been much promoted saying that actually LTNs don't distinguish between the rich and poor. And you could just summarize as saying there are lots of poor people in London. Some of them live outside the LTN and some of them live in the LTN. So actually, I think there is evidence that they don't particularly privilege richer people, other than in the way that I have described, which is that actually they have caused more traffic to go down the main roads. And I think I've proposed some ways in which we might manage that, including a more sophisticated form of roads pricing, which I notice some people are talking about in the chat as well.
Just last point there, Rita.
Okay, that's all right. I can stop there. I'm sure there'll be other opportunities.
Right. No, there will be.
So not gentrification, not distinguishing between rich and poor, and it's crucial to manage the streets. I think those are the...
Thank you. No, that's perfect. I'm going to come back to you guys. We're going to keep going out and back. So don't worry, there'll be ample opportunities. Thanks, Rita. Okay, Rebecca, I'm actually going to come to you next for just the same as Rita, a few thoughts.
Yeah, so I was going back to safety, and, you know, Rita's talking about lighting when, you know, I've lived in an LTN for about 7 months now and have been, myself or my family have been a victim of crime more times than we have done in the last 15 years we've lived here. And it's always been in broad daylight. We've had our car smashed into, my son's been assaulted, tried to be robbed for his bike in broad daylight. We live in a ghost town. So these neighbourhoods are not made safer at all. And it has nothing to do with the lighting. Because I've spent the last, you know, God knows how many months locked down, I haven't been exactly wandering the streets at night. I've been travelling to work and back. And it's eerie enough in broad daylight than it is. And then another word about gentrification is, I can see it happening in front of my eyes. Islington is being gentrified. We've always been an affluent stroke working class borough. And, you know, I just feel like these LTNs are influencing the more working class, making it more difficult for people to make a living. While cycle shops are popping up, Whole Food shop that we don't afford to work in. I took a drive around Hackney and, you know, I'm going through council estate after council estate while the leafier streets are quiet. And that stinks to me of gentrification. It isn't fair on the working class. It's to suit one minority of people that support the agenda.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Rebecca. Daniel, I'll come to you next, and then I'll go back to the audience. So Emma and Niall, when I come back, I will come to you guys in the next round because I want to keep coming back to the audience. So Daniel, your thoughts?
All right. First point is, I should have said this earlier. I'm very fortunate, and I live round the corner. I don't live in it, from one of the two most expensive streets in London in terms of buying a house. And lo and behold, of course, I should have said at the beginning, we're in an LTN. I mean, ours is 40 years old. It's the first LT. It was actually put in by the GLC. It's a very modest one. It's just 2 no entry signs on one side of it. And because of the way the streets were laid out, we don't get any through traffic, or very little through traffic. And it's interesting, just doesn't prove anything generally, but it's just an interesting point that it is one of the richest areas in London, but it's got an LTN. Does that tell you anything? I'm not sure. And it's had it for 40 years. Second thing about managing streets, Rita, yeah. Of course, the streets need to be managed in the sense, of course, that they've got to be maintained. and there are duties that the Highways Authority has got to keep them clear and things like that, so that the pavements aren't cluttered up with all sorts of things. I appreciate all of that. I didn't mean that. I really wanted to make my point on this in relation to what Shirley said, because Shirley went to my beloved Exhibition Road, of which I was responsible for Exhibition Road, and you came away fearful. And the point is, you think when you're on a pavement, you think that you have acquired a level of safety which is illusory. The streets are not particularly safe where you go. People get killed on the streets, even when they have pavements. It's an illusory sense of safety. The only real safety you get on the streets is by being alert to what others are doing. And that does involve an element of risk. To be alert, you need to be aware something could actually go wrong. So you use your eyes and you look where you're going, and you use your sense of what you're doing. And that, I think, is antithetical to the notion, this is what I was really trying to get at, Rita, that you've got to have a lane for this, a lane for people, a lane for buses, a completely regimented, top-down Soviet allocation of space. And I see somebody in the chat has said, he's used the expression, we must have a reallocation of space from one type of user to another. There is no happiness in any of that, because of course you always have to pick a favored winner who gets more space, other people are losers. A more shared space approach, like you see in Exhibition Road, is both more efficient in terms of the road, and it actually helps bring about more safety. And the final point on safety is this. Of course, street lighting does matter at night, and nobody would say we should have unlit streets, and it can contribute to a sense of safety. But I've forgotten your name, I'm sorry, but as you said in Islington, the real safety on streets comes from overlooking, and a sense that there are shop fronts, there are people looking, and those cars going by are part of that overlooking. And you take the cars away, you take the vehicles away. It could be bicyclists as well, of course, it's not just cars, it's bicyclists and other people going past. But you take those people away, and what you get is barren streets in which you engender a sense of fearfulness, and you give opportunities to people to do mugging and assaults and things like that, that perhaps are a little bit greater, but it's not the reality so much as the fearfulness, which is not always based on reality, the sense of fear of going down places where nothing is happening and nobody can see you. Mm-hmm. That's what I think is important about safety.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Daniel. Right, let's come back out to the audience for some questions. So, Victoria, I want to come to you first. What is your contribution?
Have you unmuted me? Can everybody hear me okay?
Yes, if you might be better to speak a bit louder, you're a bit quiet.
Okay, is that better? Can everybody hear me? Okay, I guess my point, I've got lots of points, but the one I'm going to focus on is there seems to be very little focus applied to the potential negative mental health impacts of LTNs. I think that the backdrop of the global pandemic cannot be obviously overstated. And I live in Bowes LTN, where the only vehicular access for us is via the 6th busiest road in the UK, which is the A406. And that has led, if I speak personally, to increased isolation. We've had various individuals not willing to come and visit or deliver items. I run a business, and sometimes I have very large deliveries and I can't get the delivery driver to come and collect those. So there's been a whole range of issues that have been exacerbated by the LTN, which has impacted on my well-being and the well-being of my family. And I just wondered, in all of the analytics surrounding LTNs, there is very little focus on the mental well-being and the sense of individual impacts of such drastic changes at one of the most disturbing times in living memory.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Victoria. I mean, in particular, people have touched on the relationship of these moves to the pandemic, but thank you for raising that again, because I think we could do with talking that a bit more, both in terms of the claims that it's been brought in covertly through, explanations around social distancing, but also, implementing rules that would, as you're saying, increase isolation at a time, and what we're already incredibly isolated. What effect does that have? So thank you for that. Rob Lyons next.
Hello, hi.
Hi, Rob.
You caught me on the hop. Hello. Yes, I just wanted to, because it's very metropolitan, this discussion, I have to say. I spent 16 years living in London, and now I live in the polar opposite, which is a village on Scottish borders. But what strikes me, what the commonality here is that there's this real sense that travel doesn't, and particularly independent travel, i.e. cars and so on, it's really been downgraded in sort of the broader consciousness. Is that, you know, the idea that, yeah, we want to get places and want to get there as quickly as possible, has really been lost. So in all the villages now in the Scottish borders, on the main roads, if you pass through somewhere, you have to travel at 20 miles an hour. In Edinburgh, which is the nearest big city, many of the main roads again are now 20 miles an hour, which is bonkers. I have no problem with side roads being 20 miles an hour. I don't want somebody tearing up and down, you know, my street in front of the house. But that sense that you know, that getting somewhere fast, you know, it is an important thing, and the freedom that independent travel gives you is more and more being dismissed by a certain influential minority of society. And I think that that if transport means, you know, getting places quickly, and we should have much freedom to choose how that comes about, and all this kind of top-down architecture for controlling how, you know, how freely we move, I think is a really big problem. And I think that for the good of society as a whole, productivity of society as a whole, I think that we really need to have a push back against that.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Rob. Great, even if it was on the hop. Right, Ian Watt, you up next, Ian.
Can you hear me?
Yes, hi.
Yeah, hi. So, you know, I was affected by this about 5 years ago when they closed some in my area. And the more I think about it, the more that the entire scheme seems like a complete and utter load of nonsense. I mean, there's loads and loads of ways to reduce the number of traffic. And there's also loads and loads of reasons that you choose to cycle. You know, for example, in London, the fact that your bike gets stolen almost inevitably, if you leave it overnight, is a huge one. So what really worries me is that these things are basically being done to raise money, so the council can raise money. I think there's a sense of wanting to be green, but really that's a guise for the much more important issue of raising as much money as they can. So my question would be, I've got kind of a three parts. The question is, one, why should they be allowed to kind of manufacture these reports, which of course are going to be completely in their favor? Like, I think they're taking pollution readings inside the LTNs, you know, during lockdown. So of course they're going to prove that they've reduced pollution numbers. I mean, how can we get the reporting on this to kind of be completely independent? Another point is, why don't they, or question, why does no one value the main streets? You know, I live on Southgate Road in London, there's, you know, Church Street. These are like the most important streets we live on, with all the best shops where everyone comes, mums, you know, young kids, everyone. Why does the council not value those streets as being some of the best places that should have less traffic on them, and if not more?
Okay.
And what my final point is,
oh, you're pushing it, make it brief. If
this is all about money, how can we kind of, you know, prove this, and what can we do about it? That's it.
Okay, it was brief, so very good. Thank you very much, Ian. Right, next we will go to Tom Swithenbank.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes, hi Tom.
Hi, I'm in Bristol, and we are they are currently consulting on the strategy for low traffic neighbourhoods. Yeah, it's really just to say, I think, you know, it seems like a mistake that London's pressed ahead in the emergency measures. But yeah, I think there's a lot of anti this and anti that, but maybe we need some more solutions. I don't know if anyone has other ideas to actually tackle the crises that we face at the moment. I mean, there's been mention of fuel fuel duty freezing. I mean, yeah, I'd just like to see some other ideas in the chat. You know, we've basically got to halve driving, double walking and cycling. What ideas do people have for that? You know, it's all well and good saying this is rubbish, but you know, what other ideas do people have? Because this is, you know, this is happening.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks. That's a great challenge. Thanks very much, Tom. Well, I mean, in particular, if this debate is about streets and LTNs and all that kind of thing, but obviously there are other questions about, you know, cities don't have to be static. Cities don't have to, London changes in particular every single day, expands, you know, moves about. So might some of the solutions lie not in restricting, but in expanding out things and opening up opportunities. Okay, I'm going to come to Joel. I'm going to come to Joel Cohn, then Josephine Hussey, and then Alistair Donald, and I'm going to come back to Emma and Niall on the panel, and then we're going to come back out to the audience. So bear with me, everyone. If you've got your hand up, you will be speaking tonight. I'm not going to leave anyone out. So, Joel.
The last speaker asked for a few ideas. I suggest one of the bigger barriers to getting more people cycling and walking is that only about 50% of the country owns a bike. That's probably a really good place to start. I think kind of listening to the breadth of this discussion, and it's a real credit to the Academy of Ideas for making this debate a bit more meaningful than some of the other fare you get discussing this issue in really quite a polarized way. At the heart, it's about kind of competing senses of what public space should be for, which is an issue that I know that the Academy has been thinking about for a very long time. And I think it's a really rich vein of thought because, you know, both sides of the typical debate that you'd find out there, I think express quite a lot of NIMBYism. And that really makes me question whether NIMBYism is in fact a bad thing, or is it the starting point, the groundswell of a sense of kind of civic identity and belonging, because in order to, you know, own and encourage communities to be empowered by their spaces, you have to allow quite a broad sweep of them. And my own bugbear within this discussion is I think kind of currently the policy has been too focused on commuters at the expense of other users, which would definitely include children and their use of the streets. Some of the kind of vulnerable groups that we started talking about, either because they live with long-term health conditions and disabilities. And I think walking and cycling actually can really do a great amount to help people manage those conditions, as well as the elderly, who we know have really suffered in strength. And I'm sure as soon as life begins again, we'll see a lot more falls happening. And in a way that walking and cycling, particularly walking more than cycling, can really help people. So yeah, I think kind of in a nub, is NIMBYism bad? How can we expand the category to support everyone?
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Joel. And thanks for the kind words about the Academy of Ideas. I mean, we haven't figured out the timetable yet, but I'd just like to say to everyone that we will be addressing parts of these issues at the Battle of Ideas Festival, which is going to be happening in the autumn of this year. We've got a date that we are finalising at the moment, so please put in your diaries autumn with the Battle of Ideas Festival, and I would love to see all 126 of you at that debate. Right, we're going to have Jo Hussey next.
Hi, I grew up in London. I was born and bred in London, and basically when I lived in in Clapham, and I hardly felt the need to use a car. Basically, whenever I went out, I usually got a bus, or I went on the tube once I moved to North London, because we didn't have tubes in South London. It wasn't useful to me. Often I was going out with friends and might have a drink or whatever. I wanted good public transport, and that's mainly what I did. I used a car when it was important that I got somewhere, or I picked someone up or something. And I do think that one of the problems is that the whole discussion and the whole imposition of these zones removes people's individual right to make a decision about how they're going to get somewhere. But what I also think is really interesting is I now live in a country, in a village in the country, and I have no choice. I have to use my car. I cannot get to work by public transport because it's rubbish. Even if I decide to go to London, I can get a train to London, but I still have to drive to the station to get the train to London. And one thing that I wondered, and I wanted to throw out there, was are we focusing on the cities and saying that the cities are really a problem when actually they're not really a problem? I mean, a lot of people have said that a lot of the policies have made cars appear a big more of a problem now in London than they really are, and that pollution is considered to be a bigger problem than it really is. I mean, I grew up in a vibrant city that was surrounded by transport, and as people have said, it was because it was a vibrant city that it had lots of transport. But you know, by focusing on the city and saying the city is the problem, really are we starting to spread this idea of cars being a problem across the country? So I just wanted to throw that in, really.
Brilliant, thanks, Jo. Okay, we'll take Alistair Donald, and then we're going to come back to Emma and Niall for comments. So, Alistair.
Thanks, Ella. I really enjoyed Daniel's explanation of the ownership of streets at the start, and the sense of understanding what is in public ownership and what's not. And I think in some ways, the whole idea of the public is the key to this discussion, actually, because not the public in the sense of of who technically owns something, but the public in the sense of what it is in a social sense. And I think one of the problems just now is that there's a very fragmentary sense of the public. So, you know, those who might want cars to keep the cars on the street might not want a nightclub in the same street or in the area. Those who want to keep the streets clear of cars might not be keen on kids from a neighbouring, another neighbourhood coming to be part of the activity of that street. There's this kind of, the public lacks any sense of cohesion, not in the sense that everybody should agree with each other, but just in the sense that cities, by their very nature to work, have to be a bit about giving and taking, of recognizing other people's interests and accommodating to them. And I think one of the problems today is that we seem to address public life in a way that we're always out to get what we personally want and what our grouping wants, and dismissive of the claims of other people. You see it all the time just now, for example, in the debates around free speech and around protests, where everybody's trying to protect their own group's right to protest, but is rather dismissive of the rights of other groups to protest. So I think understanding the public and understanding the public in a kind of political sense of we're all in it and we have to accommodate to different needs is quite important just now. And so that when it comes to the question of consultation, which a number of people have posed as a solution, I think, well, fine, have consultation, but it just strikes me that people are asking what is a rather technical process of consulting with other people to do the work of which is a social, sorting out socially what it is that we understand ourselves to be as a public.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Alistair. Okay, Emma and Niall, I'm going to come to you for comments. And then, as you may have noticed, we've got 10 people with their hands up and we are running out of time. I'm okay to run over a little bit, but I don't want to hold the speakers for too long. So let's all be pretty snappy. But Emma, any thoughts you want to pick up on from anything you've heard of the last sort of half an hour?
Yeah, just to say it's absolutely fascinating. A couple of things I want to say is, firstly, this idea that things have been done quickly. One of the headlines in the Manchester Evening News tonight is about an LTN that has been put in somewhere to use up budget quickly. And so exactly some of these things that have been spoken about how that community are okay, but the streets, the surrounding streets are now just packed full of the traffic that would normally go down there. So this goes back again to what I was talking about earlier about that consultation, and the gentleman that's just been speaking is right. It's got to be different. It's got to be co-creation. We've got to think about things differently. And I think the other point I wanted to talk about was the climate and environmental, which has come up on the chat a little bit. A lot of the stock that people are thinking about is social housing, and that's what I've been working in for 25 years, and every housing association at the moment is having to look at decarbonisation, and they're also having to respond to the white paper that's come out about resident engagement. So I think that's where some of the solution to this will lie. And I think it's about, we have to embrace and look at all aspects of how we're going to solve this problem. And I think that, you know, there's obviously very different experiences that are happening in parts of London that are happening in other parts of the country, but we need to learn from where it's not happening right and make sure that that's communicated so that we can get things that are more meaningful.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Emma. Niall, I'll come to you for a few thoughts.
Thanks. Great discussion. I don't think cars are a problem. I don't think carbon is a problem. I think it's a great thing. Car usage has been going down since the year 2000, but I think it's a fantastic thing that in my lifetime, ordinary working class people can afford decent cars. You know, I never thought in my lifetime I'd be able to, you know, drive around in a Mercedes, although I can't afford a Mercedes, but you know, you do see people, the buildings maintenance people at work drive around in Mercedes because they've got you know, because they've got access via, you know, via credit. Interestingly, all of the teachers and you know, go around on Bromptons and everything. So there seems to be a middle class falling out of love with the cars, and I don't think the generally working class people have caught on yet. So they're being forced, and I really reject that. You know, right? We did a survey with a group and we asked about 700 people, Hackney, who what they use their cars for. Horrendous Hackney road closures are started by women, young working class women, never involved in politics, and so was the Islington group, I believe. It's mainly women that it's affecting, women of all ages. I can see out of my window that the people who drive cars around by me on the council estate over the road are mainly young families. So it's really affecting them. And I'm not sure I even accept the idea of low traffic neighbourhoods, because what I can see with the estates over the road is people just being closed in. You know, it's being made as difficult as possible for people to get around. Call it a low traffic neighbourhood, call it what you want, but you know, I think that it's an attack on you know, working class living standards in that sense. And Joel, just responding to Joel, surely it's up to people whether they cycle or walk. It's no business of the council. You know, do people have different needs, and it's up for them to decide, really, not for the council.
Okay, brilliant. Thanks very much, Niall. Right, speakers, I'm now going to go through the 10 people who have had their hands up, who are all going to promise me to be brief. And then I'm going to come back to you guys for your final thoughts, picking up on anything. So if you just hold tight for a bit, if that's all right. We are going to run a bit over past, but I think it's worth it because I'm really enjoying this debate. People who have your hands up, if you've had your hand up or beforehand, I'm afraid you're engaging in wishful thinking because we're going to take people who haven't spoken first. So Mark Dunn, let's come to you and hear what you have to say.
Hi, thank you everybody for this discussion. Just to say, I came to this quite late really. I was completely oblivious to LTNs being put up around me in the East End of London. And I suppose it occurred to me something was going on when traffic started to increase on my road. And then I did a bit of digging and found out why. My opposition to it, and I'm quite firmly opposed to it really, is that it feels tokenistic and divisive, and actually traffic is a burden for all Londoners, and it should be shared. I can't see really how any solution that creates more noise and pollution inequality can be acceptable. And I'll leave it there because I had more to say, but you've got 10 others to get through.
Lovely. No, that's the spirit of it. Thanks very much, Mark. Okay, we're going to Matthew next. Matthew Penchars.
Hi, thank you very much. I am very much in favour of LTNs, and I've been very involved in my own LTN group in Lambeth, in Brixton in London. However, it's done me a lot of good to be on this, to listen in on this debate, see my old colleague Daniel Moylan and lots of people who are opposed to LTNs, because there's always a danger of a filter bubble, and you only ever listen to people who agree with you. But I think there's a few, actually quite a few misconceptions that a lot of the antis here opposed to this have. Clearly, there's been a mistake about not consulting the local residents properly, and that's something that we did in our group, in that we really warned people that this was coming, and there's been less, I suppose, animus against it than perhaps in other areas. But I think it is worth noting that we have an election in 2 months in London for the mayor, and then we have an election in a year and 2 months for the boroughs. So we can vote all these guys out. If you really don't like it, you can vote them out. And they are all going to be due to statutory consultations. These aren't going to happen. They are all experiments. And in order to become permanent, they do need to be consulted upon. Yes, perhaps it shouldn't have been done in the way that it was. I think that's a fair point, especially during the dislocation of the pandemic. But that's not to say that they're not going to be consulted on in due course. I think it's worth noting the fact that the polling data suggests that people are largely in favour of it. And a lot of the other data that people have stated, such as traffic is definitely displaced, but in fact the LTN, Lambeth has released data around the LTN near me, and in fact traffic reduced on the boundary roads as well as within the LTN. And they did, and the consultants, and I actually read through the report, does manage to baseline it properly, mindful of the impacts of the pandemic. So they managed to get a sort of a factor there to make sure the data worked. It wasn't just comparing apples with pears rather than apples with apples. And I think that, so politicians really need to think about the balance of pros and cons. There really clearly are disbenefits in this. Of course there are, but in my view there are more benefits. And the last point I want to make, if you're mindful, I think back to very much what Tom said about being against everything, against change, that in order to meet anything like the carbon targets that nearly everybody agrees on, and certainly there's political consensus, if not necessarily within this group. I know that the gentleman from I think the pub in Hackney doesn't seem to believe there's climate change. But there needs to be a balance of the pros and cons and balance what is best. And some of them will be more negative than positive and will have to be removed, but most of them, I believe, will stay in place. We need to do these nudges. If this is the reaction that we get for just a few planters, heaven help us what sort of reaction there's going to be when other changes need to be made if we're going to meet net zero that has been legislated for. And it's important to note that a vocal minority, no matter how vocal, has no right to veto a policy that is in the majority popular, which appears to be the case in the polling, and the elections coming up will prove or disprove that.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Matthew. That was really helpful to put that side of the argument. So thank you. Austin Williams will come to you next.
Thanks. Well, I mean, that last guy said a lot in a short space of time. When he mentioned the word nudge, it's very clear that the idea that you do a consultation is in order that you get the right result and work out how best to implement a policy that you're going to otherwise enforce on people. So in some ways, it's fake consultation, just kind of glossing over the cracks in some ways. And also modeling is not the same as data, I would advise. But I just think that the idea about what is the problem? Why are cars a problem? Since for 100 years they've been seen as a boon. And if anybody remembers, the last Labour government has always brought in a transport policy, started the transport policy of conflictual relationships between we need to invest in public transport in order to get people out of the cars. So it's always been that sense of car drivers as being the problem. But actually, in terms of statistics, the growth in traffic, Niall started to mention it, from 1950 up to 1990, that's when the growth of traffic happened. And then since then, the growth of cars has declined. Or the number of car journeys has declined. That 50% of all journeys are by car. 37% today are by car, as opposed to 50% in 1990. And that's even predicted to be 27% by the mid-century. And that's without a pandemic, which is destroying the car industry as well as the commercial sector. And we've got this very bizarre situation where there's a perception of cars being a problem. We've kind of invented this problem, and in some ways that's how we're going to have to deal with it. How much road space has been lost in London to increase that perception of cars being a problem is worth an inquiry. But I think that, even just looking at this idea about noise, it's kind of such a middle class concern, isn't it? The noise in London, my God. I'm now living in the countryside, and I long for a bit of noise. But even there's a question asked in House of Parliament today saying that why we shouldn't have protesters is because of noise. This kind of paranoia. There's even low noise surfaces on roads now today. So everything's improving, but the perception is that it's all getting worse. And I think that that's an inverse relation to reality. And I think we just need to get a little bit of grounding in what really is going on before we kind of have this conversation which insists that cars are a problem. How best are we going to implement getting rid of them? That's not an equation.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Austin. Okay, Roland Hughes next.
Thank you. Hi, everybody. It's a great debate. Great to be here. Right. I just want to say, really,
I'm living in the Bowes LTN in Enfield. Literally, we had no warning of this. Pandemic started and it came through the door. At best, this is reckless to do at this time. At worst, it's cruel. It's caused a massive problem for emergency services. People have been very disorientated during this last year as we've all lived through this pandemic. Really, it's just it's the tail wagging the dog. It was a handful of people pushing for this, and what I'm most distressed about is there are no clear KPIs, key performance indicators, as to how they're going to show this scheme as a success or failure. And all of the talk is about amendments only. They don't like to mention that we can have it taken out. They're not interested in us having a say on that. And there's been a lot of fudging of the figures and manipulation of that. We've seen traffic counters on newly created dead-end roads, no proper counters on displaced traffic roads. And, and we've seen hard landscaping done on what's meant to be a trial temporary scheme. You don't do hard landscaping when there are plans to take it out. It's a fait accompli for some people in the council. The next thing I wanted to say was
very briefly.
I'd be very quick. I'm a cyclist and a driver, and I really worry that these things need to be done in open, transparent ways, and to actually not consult first. They've used the pandemic as an opportunity to force something upon people and call it a live trial. And I really worry that this is actually setting back the green agenda. You have to take people with you. People are very open to change, but you have to take people with you. Finally, I just want to say, yes, I agree, car use is coming down. We're seeing that. A lot of young people aren't driving these days. And we are seeing we have Euro 6 coming in this year in London, the extension of the LEZ zone. And so exhausts are getting cleaner. There's transport revolution. We'll have the self-drive soon. But, there's the euphemism of language as well, calling roads filtered when they're actually closed to traffic. There's a lot of manipulation of data. And we've asked for an open, transparent referendum of whether we want it to stay or go. And the council is not interested. So this claiming that silent majority is very disingenuous. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Roland, for that. Right, we'll come to Dennis Russell next. Just to manage everyone's expectations, I'm not going to be able to take people who have already spoken, I'm afraid, because we're running out of time. So I'm going to take Dennis, then Anna, then Neil, then Briege, and then we're back to the panel. So Dennis, floor is yours.
Well, I'm a van driver in London, one of the despicable deplorables. And I pay, £380 odd pounds a year road tax. People who ride bicycles pay none, and I'm barred from practically 3/4 of the roads in my Islington borough, in the area where I live. It used to take me 10 minutes to get to work. Now it takes me nearly 3/4 of an hour. So I'm sitting in my van pumping out fumes for an extra sort of 30-35 minutes every day. So are all the buses who go the same routes as me. I can't see how the LTNs are of any value, but in terms of the pollution side of things. But, there are in terms of councillors, people elected to the councils, 8,500 people elected every so often to sit on the councils across this country. And there's now a layer of people who I would argue are, politically and culturally sort of all, from the same type of background, who are imposing on us a whole set of ideas that they have about, the environment, about climate change, and about how to deal with it. And they're doing so with very limited turnout in terms of legitimacy. It ranges from between, in the lowest boroughs, 20% of the local people vote for them, to the highest, Richmond upon Thames, where something like 54-55% of people vote for them. But the average is around 33%. So these people have no legitimacy in terms of electoral returns. They are free from any democratic control on them, because people really hate them and have been turned off voting for them down through the years, not just in relation to LTNs, but in relation to a whole host of issues, housing, other problems, bin collections, you name it. But so these people are free from any kind of control, and they're imposing their own values on everybody else and making life quite miserable for people. I know, you know, it would be nice to live in a pollution-free climate, but a city is never going to be pollution-free, never, under any circumstances, for the next conceivable, you know, 200 or 300 years. So, you know, they are making most of us, most at least of the working people who have to travel through London to work every day, they're making life really, really miserable for us.
Okay, brilliant. Thank you very much, Dennis. Okay, Anna's iPhone will come to you next.
Hi there. Yeah, obviously I'm not Anna, I'm Francisco, sorry. So I must say that I'm a driver, but I'm one of those drivers who don't mind to give way to pedestrians when they are crossing the road. So maybe that's why I have no major problems with LTNs, because I think that I understand the need to share the space, which is limited in an urban environment, specifically like in London. So the space, the physical space needs to be shared. And when we start to suggest to people who have owned the space for so many years that eventually they will need to start to share it with other type of users, either pedestrians, cyclists, that's when the problem started. Is the arrogance of drivers in insisting that specific 8 meters between curb to curb is just for cars. It is not for cars. It's for pedestrians, it's for cyclists, it's for any other person who does not choose to drive a car on that one. Just another thing I think I would like to raise is so local councils historically, they react to problems. So they have a reactive approach. Eventually, on some of the LTNs, they use the more proactive approach. So they are trying to be a little bit ahead of the curve. So the problem with traffic volumes, with excessive traffic volumes is here, is not going away, and it's going to get worse. So what some of the council, I believe, are doing is trying to react to a problem that might not be here yet, but if nothing is done, it will be worse in a couple of years. So, and that's eventually why people are so upset with these measures, because they are historically they are prepared to see the councils just to react and not to be proactive. And just last
very brief.
one. Yeah, okay, very last one. So another thing I would like to raise, with the driving software that we now have, so with Google Maps, with Maze, with all of these GPS. So what they do is, as soon as there's some congestion on main roads, they divert any traffic to these residential roads. So back a couple of years ago, we would have just locals using the local roads because they had the local knowledge. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, we have everyone driving with a telephone in front of there, and they are using Google Maps and all of that to be diverted to the residential streets. So a couple of years ago, we had 100, 200, a couple of hundred vehicles in residential roads. Nowadays, I think we have thousands. So that's why measures like the LTNs need to be brought.
Okay, thank you very much, Francisco. That was great. Okay, Neil Christie, let's come to you next.
Thanks. Hi, everyone. I've got a question mainly for Rebecca and Niall because I'm calling from Islington. We've just seen early results from the St. Peter's LTN in Islington, which have shown significant reductions in traffic within the LTNs, no overall increase in traffic or pollution on the main roads, no negative impact on emergency response vehicle times, no negative impact on crime or antisocial behavior, and an increase in cycling. Now, I know people will attack this evidence, but rather than attacking the evidence, even though it's been independently peer reviewed, rather than attacking it, let's just say for a moment that these results are accurate. On that basis, would encouraging results like these lead you to consider any aspects of your opposition to LTNs?
Great, thanks very much, Neil. That was great. Right, we'll end with Breege.
Hi,
Most people in one way or another have talked about the lack of engagement in regard to LTNs, and that's obviously very true. And some people have suggested that they've been sneaked in during the COVID lockdown, etc. But in reality, I think the councils have gotten very used to the fact that they don't expect to have engagement or feedback from people because we have absented ourselves from political engagement, and they have gotten used to making decisions and imposing decisions on us, and the LTNs is an example of that. The NHS has been doing this for years, and I used to work in that area. So I guess tokenism is what they're used to, and tokenistic engagement had become very normal. It's like, you rent a gob and they will supposedly represent you. But we have to think about how do we get back and engaged as engaged in decision making, if that's what is needed in order to inform decision making.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, Breeze. Right, I'm going to come back to the panel now. I mean, it's been really fascinating to hear some of the points raised. I'm one of those people who's can come at it from both sides. In terms of cycling and driving and walking, when I cycle to work across Tower Bridge, I'm one of those cyclists that is cursing people from driving too close to me, and also probably I'm being cursed by others for occasionally, going too fast over lights or maneuvering out of the way. Similarly, when I'm in the van, which I refuse to go on public transport to get my shop from Aldi in Leighton, because anyone knows the Aldi in Leighton, I'd rather pluck my eyeballs out than get public transport back with my shopping bags. But I don't do it just out of necessity. I also do it because I still love driving in my white van and making people in Hackney double take seeing a woman in lipstick in a white van. So it's one of these things where I think people can come at it from different anecdotal positions. But the question I want to kind of leave the panel with, although pick up on anything you like, is not what is the solution to this in terms of, I'm not asking you to come up with a kind of green or non-green 5-point plan, but it is to answer the central question of this debate. Who is it that is really making these decisions? I mean, that final point by Briege about whether or not there's a wider problem with public engagement at large. I mean, it would sort of having miniature local referendums on LTNs fix the problem? Is more voting going to fix the problem? Or is there something deeper in actually the relationship between the toss-up of climate change on the one hand and city living on the other, if you want to make it that kind of dichotomy? Or how do we overcome the central question of who owns the streets, not just from the kind of legal or pragmatic basis, but also the more political idea of who is it that makes the decisions that shape our lives and shape our surroundings. So I'm going to go in the order that we started with, and really just a minute or two, guys, because I haven't left you very long, a minute or two to leave us with something, either pick up on anything or leave us with a punchy point. No pressure. So Rita, I'll begin with you. Hang on. There you are.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, you're a little bit quiet, but
okay, is that better?
If you just shout for us, Rita.
Okay, I mean, I'm actually, you've left us with a kind of huge philosophical question, Ella, and I suppose partly it depends on whether or not you believe in representative democracy, is what I would say. And a few people have been talking about, voting and elections coming up and that sort of thing. I think you mentioned it too. But just to pick up, it's patently obvious that there's a lot of anger around about these things. And I guess, it's good to have had the opportunity to sort of vent, in a sense, for people as well, sort of air their views. But I did want to pick up on the reference that Niall made to a parklet, and actually the quality of community cohesion that has resulted from the fact of having been privileged, and I say privileged, so I applied and hold a license to have a parklet on my street, and what a benefit it has been to the street in lockdown for people to be able to coalesce and provide a centre for everyone, and not just the people on the street, but neighbours from far and wide to come and actually have that little bit of outdoor space. And who decided that curbsides should be left entirely to these empty metal boxes, and they are empty and motionless a lot of the time, rather than, for example, parklets? I just think that's completely nuts, you know, and I think it's not fair. I did say it's not fair. I wanted to say that people in vans are key users of the main roads, and they are not the sort of people who would, you know, exactly, it's those are the people who should be using the main roads. It's the private cars and the multiplicity of private cars for which I really don't think it's not fair to have the number that we have in London, however libertarian you might want to be. That's it.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Rita, for that. We'll now move over to Daniel for your final thoughts.
Thanks. I just think it's interesting that the word private is used as a bad word. You know, you put private in front of something and immediately becomes a bad thing. I just want to make a couple of points. I had some answers. I had some provocative questions in the chat. I'm not going to be able to respond to if I'm only limited to a minute. But I'd say, first of all, although the mayor set off justifying this on the grounds that London would be brought to a standstill if after the pandemic we had a car-led recovery, there is actually no sign and that there is likely to be gridlock as a result of a car-led recovery. And this isn't really about congestion. The drive to reduce cars is a drive partly masking as carbon, but it will carry on even if all the cars become electric. There will still be a drive against them because that word private is attached to them, and private in certain minds actually equates to bad. The second thing I want to say is I haven't said anything, I think, today that suggests that all low traffic neighborhoods are bad. But I do think that to make them work, they have to come out of the community themselves. So the answer to this is not local referendums. This is not a majoritarian thing. This is about people in a community coming together as a community and wanting to see their area reduced in the amount of through traffic. And then this is the really important thing. And then negotiating with their neighbors who will not actually benefit from it. Because the people who make these demands are the most articulate people, and they tend to be better off. So they need to be required to negotiate with their neighbors to get a consensus. This should not be coming from councils, it should be coming to councils from communities. That way it will work. And that way people will value their low traffic neighborhoods. The disbenefits and externalities will be limited, and they won't be controversial.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Daniel. That was great. Okay, let's move to Emma Richman for your final thoughts.
So I've just got 2 sentences. Zero carbon decarbonisation is coming. So we all need to be ready for that. But the big thing that someone said, which I think sums up quite a lot, is you need to take people with you.
Brilliant. Okay, great. Thanks very much, Emma. Right, we'll now go to Rebecca. Where are you, Rebecca? Rebecca, your thoughts, please.
So Neil Christie had a question for me. I couldn't quite remember the exact question, but he was back to the data that's been released by the council in the St. Peter's trial, the first LTN. And I feel like the data of this is skewed, as he said that there was no increase in traffic when there is a 32% increase in traffic on a neighbouring road, New North Road. I would have to attack the surveys that they use, because evidence shows that surveys and consultations are leading and not reflective, and I dare say fixed. If it was true, they would have consulted legitimately and fairly, not dodging equality impact assessments and failing to consult with emergency services. I have a FOI with the London Ambulance Service that said they couldn't support a scheme that blocked the roads, yet we still have bollards closing the roads. So if you call that a consultation, I don't know what it is. Some studies and commentators on the pro side have been exposed in making things up and making them look genuine, like that line in emergency services aren't impacted, which was presented by a math pro LTNer in The Guardian, Rachel Aldridge, only to be rubbish by emergency services. We shouldn't be relying on council elections to determine when we stop wasting public money. Democracy isn't one vote every 4 years. It's normal people being involved in community decisions and not to wait every 4 years to have their say. We all want a cleaner, better environment for our children to grow up, having cleaner, greener borough rammed down my throat by the council. But if London Borough of Islington was serious about becoming a greener borough, then they need to target big business. My workplace doesn't even have a school facilities, and it's recently been exposed by the dispatches that it's taking our recycling to incinerating branches. So this doesn't strike me as being a cleaner borough. I feel like you're targeting the motorists in a mabbing campaign, really. The data and statistics is not reflective because we haven't yet felt the true effects of the closing these roads as we've been in lockdown the whole time. Yeah, I could go on and on and on. I've got stuff about the bin collections. Someone else said, I think it was Dennis said about the bin collections. And I know the council have made exemptions now for their fleet of vehicles because they're providing essential services. But to everyone, I think, that uses a vehicle for that, all their journeys are essential for work, not just the council ones. And totally would support Roland's suggestion that we need referendums, you know, for clear, concise yes or no. Not by companies like Sustrans or Project Star or any consulting need to do these skewed consultations, just a straight referendum to know what the people of Islington think.
Okay, great. Thanks very much, Rebecca. And now, last but not least, Niall Crowley.
I'll try and be quick. Brilliant debate, everybody. Thank you. Thank you very, very much. Just in response to Rita on parklets, I had a letter this week from a parish priest in Hackney after he saw the thing about my launch of my election campaign, and he wrote to me and he said to me, I'm the parish priest of, I won't name where he was, and had exactly the same situation you described. There's a plan in place led by Hackney Living Streets and supported by the mayor and the council for a parklet across 2 3 parking spaces in streets across the road from my church. My principal objection is that there has been absolutely no consultation whatsoever, and this is being billed as a grassroots project. He goes on to talk about how he's written and been ignored. I'm fast growing tired of the wealthy few in Hackney making decisions in ignorant benevolence on behalf of the people of Hoxton. So that was that. I just wanted to echo what Dennis said. My central point is that the way these have been done have really revealed a kind of democratic void, which is my major concern. I didn't get involved in this because I was a driver, but because my heart went out to my fellow citizens, seeing what the council was doing to them. I looked at the mayor said something to me last week about this has all been consulted. We've talked about this in the past. So I looked at the consultancy report for their 10-year plan, and literally only a handful of people. I talked to 40 or 50 people answering the consultation report. There really is no legitimacy for any of this stuff. So we've got a big task ahead of us, and but I think there is a democratic void that we need to address. So I think it's down to us. But thank you very much.
Brilliant. Thank you very much to all the speakers and to everyone who's contributed to tonight's debate. It was really, really wonderful. I'm not very good at doing this mute unmute, but if you could all just join me in giving a clap to our speakers. Thank you very much. But really, it just, opening up so many questions. I mean, we could go on endlessly about this in very interesting tangents, because the whole question of who owns our streets opens up wider discussions about, we've touched on climate change, we've touched on democracy, we've touched on class, it really encompasses so many different parts of politics, this seemingly small thing, a street, whether or not you can park on a street, whether you can drive, blows open so much political discussion. So thank you to the speakers and to you in the audience for having a really great discussion. I want to just alert you, while I have you, to a few things coming up with the Academy of Ideas. I've already mentioned Letters on Liberty, and Austin Williams, who spoke in the audience contribution, has written, is about to be published, a pamphlet on on development and on green issues, so you should read that. And Alistair Donald, who also spoke from the floor, has just written something on Scotland and Scottish independence and the question of Scotland and politics coming up. So those will be out in a number of weeks. But also relating to Scotland, one of our upcoming events, a free event, which you might like to all attend, is our next Academy of Ideas Salon, Scotland Salon, which is called What Next for Scottish Independence? And that's on Tuesday, the 23rd of March from 7 till 9. And we've got, to discuss what the Salmond Affair in particular means for prospects of independence, with Michelle Ballantyne, MSP, Alistair Donald speaking, Ian McWhirter and Jim Sillars. And all of our events at the Academy of Ideas are free to attend, but they're not free to run. So if you can and you feel able to donate to us or join as an Academy of Ideas associate, please follow the link that's going to be put in the chat, academyofideas.org.uk/support. It really means a lot to us. This debate will go up online on our YouTube, so please, if you enjoyed it, share it around with your friends, put it up on Twitter. We'd like to have more of these discussions, and we will be having more of these discussions. And I have plugged the battle one last time because I'm obsessed with the fact that we've now got a date roughly in the diary. So it's happening in autumn. Don't go anywhere on any luxurious holidays in and around the end of September, beginning of October, because I want you to be in Westminster with us debating. So that's all from me. Thank you very much. Thank you to our speakers again. Have a great evening. And what I'm going to do now is the sort of rather raucous thing of unmuting everyone who wants to be unmuted, and I'll leave this space open for 10 minutes for free-flowing discussion for a few minutes. So thank you all, good night, and I'm going to allow you all to unmute yourselves now, so feel free to chat.